everyone. Welcome to this beautiful Monday in June. We are coming to you live from the beautiful city of New Orleans in Louisiana at the United Public Radio Network at 107.7 FM and the UFO Paranormal Radio Network at 105.3 FM. We are on Facebook, we're on Roku, we're on Rumble, and we are on YouTube. We have a really good show for you tonight. I just want to take a second to thank our sponsor, Carnation. We love you guys. I've been using you a lot lately. I've been cooking with you. We got company coming this week and I cannot wait. So thank you. Preston, I'm going to hang it over to you.
Thank you, Dolly. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And guess what? Episode 112 of The Light Gate. We're over 2 years now into this show, still going strong, bringing you all kinds of wonderful guests. Just last week, we had Philip Mantle. What a fun show that was. UK researcher. We're definitely bringing him back. He had a lot to share. We only touched the surface. If you didn't get a chance to catch that show, all our shows are, of course, archived. Now, I, of course, am your host, Preston Bennett, and my lovely co-host is, of course, Dolly Saffron, experiencer, subject of the book Symmetry. Check it out. We're working on a sequel, so that should be pretty exciting. Definitely going to have it out this year, no matter what I do. I'm going to get it out this year. I also do want to announce that my book, Humanoids and High Strangeness, is now in Audible form, because I know a lot of you out there prefer Audible books. They're getting to be increasingly popular. I'm trying to get all my books on Audible. Some of my publishers won't do it. I don't know why, but most of my books are sooner or later going to get there. So yeah, if you want to check that out, that's awesome. But let me say a quick hi to all you folks in chat. We love you so much. It's just such a warm and fuzzy feeling to see you all each week. It truly is. We absolutely adore our Lightgate family. So let's see who we have here. We have Greg, all the way from Bonnie, Scotland, and 3 big smiles. Very cool.
That is cool. I was singing Loch Lomond today. No kidding. I'm not kidding you. I really was.
Yeah, we had Malcolm Robinson 2 weeks ago from Scotland. So
Yep.
We got Kaleidoscope Eyes from Knoxville, Tennessee.
Kaleidoscope.
We have the amazing Janie Mashburn.
Janie.
Good evening, and thank you, Janie. You are absolutely wonderful. We truly appreciate your generosity. Helps us a lot. So thank you. And okay, nice crowd today. We have Patsy Foister.
Hi, Patsy.
We have the wonderful Michael Kennedy, always bringing the popcorn.
So, I love her. Hello.
Thank you, Michael, for joining us. I love to see all you guys here. It's just so cool. We have Alan Roser. We have OGG staying up late all the way from the UK.
Hey, thank you.
And Kenny McLeod, Scotland in the house. Very
cool. Boy. Awesome.
Who else we have here? We have Brian Morgan.
Hi, Brian.
Always a great night when the light gate is on. How about that, Dolly?
Yes. Thank you.
And Louise. Oh, we can always count on you being here, Louise. Thank you so much. Wow. This is just so cool. We have Scarlet Fire, my favorite live show. Hey.
Yay. Thank you, Scarlet.
Heidi, hello. All the way from Boulder, Colorado. Very near where my sister lives.
Yeah, we were in Boulder last year.
Oh, yeah, for Gaia, right?
Yes. That was a lot of fun. It's beautiful there. Oh, my gosh. Yeah.
Okay, we got Jemima Morton.
Hi, Jemima.
We got me reminding you all to get your questions in early. We love questions, guys, and our guest is happy to answer them. So let me just get this moving before I get in trouble for taking too long on the introductions. So I'm going to speed through this, guys. Arvo, hello. Sunny Burnett, thank you for joining us. We got Lunar Dove.
Hi, Lunar. Very cool. Thank you.
Namaste, the amazing Namaste. Thank you so much, Namaste. We love you. It's awesome to see you here every week. You are amazing.
Yes.
Wow. We have Jeremy. We have Flea Market Gold. We have Bob Thorson. Hey,
Hi,
hi, Bob.
Bob.
Hope you're doing well. I love the post you put up describing your own experience. That illustration is something else. I love it when someone can
I
get an
know.
illustration of their experience. Just, said a picture's worth 1,000 words. I think when it comes to a UFO experience, it's
Yes.
worth a lot more than that because they're so hard to describe.
Yeah.
So that's an awesome post. We got Brenda Whelan.
Hello.
Quite a few people. Let's see. We have Teresa Levine.
Hi, Teresa.
Oh, I just have to hop this up again. Michael Kennedy, look at all those hearts. Thank you, Michael. We have J.R. Amadeus Schiffer.
They are.
The Light Gate. You
Yes.
guys are so awesome. Greg's an East Kilbride. Very
Oh,
cool.
nice. Hey, I
We
think
have
that's cool one as well.
Stargazer.
Hey,
We have
Stargazer.
Debbie C. First time for me.
Hello.
Excited.
Oh, welcome. Thank
Yay.
you.
Thanks for joining us.
Yes.
And Chris from Glasgow, Scotland. That's at least 3
Awesomeness.
people from
You
Scotland.
see, I was feeling it today. I knew it was going to happen. All guns were working right. Yeah. I'm not kidding. I put the music and I was dancing around to it and singing. Go
Alfred
figure.
Miller. We got Candy the Brave. We have Mish. And we have me running out of time. So I'm going to just bring on our guest next. I'm sorry if I missed any of you. We love you all. You know that. But let me just tell you a little bit about our guest. Here, let me remove this comment here. Yeah, our guest is actually returning. He was on the Light Gate 2-3 months ago. Just a wonderful guy, of course. Chris Stiles, Canadian UFO researcher and author. And we are so happy to have him back. He's a very active UFO researcher, boots on the ground, really does the work. He investigates classic cases as well as current UFO incidents and holds a, quote, blended view of the UFO phenomena that allows room for both the ETH, that's the extraterrestrial hypothesis, with a significant psychological component. And I absolutely respect that because there are lots of nuts and bolts researchers out there who absolutely discard anything that's paranormal or spiritual or high strangeness. I think that's a huge mistake. It's definitely a part of this. So kudos to you, Chris. He is, of course, best known for his work on the 1967 Shag Harbor incident and has presented at several MUFON symposia in both Canada and the US. He has served as a paid technical advisor with several Canadian UFO feature documentaries, such as Ocean Entertainment's The Shag Harbor UFO Incidents and Northern Lights, and of course has appeared in several US UFO specials, such as Canada's Roswell, which is of course Shag Harbor, and UFOs 2, Have We Been Visited? In 2019, he appeared in an episode of Ocean Mysteries with Celine and Fabien Cousteau of Jacques Cousteau fame.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Yeah, Dolly has a Jacques Cousteau connection that's also very cool. And of course, Chris has been on all the major podcasts, coast to coast. I mean, you name it, the Light Gate. He is the author, co-author on 2 UFO books on the Shag Harbor incident, Dark Object, but the one you really want to check out is the other one, Impact to Contact, I think it's called. And his most recent book, Sweep Clear 5 NATO's UFO Encounter. We talked a lot about those in the previous show. We're going to probably touch on that again, but go into some other new stuff. In 2023, get this, MUFON Canada presented Chris with an honorary membership in recognition of his lifetime achievement in ufology. That is no small potatoes. That's very, very cool. So yeah, time to bring Chris into the room.
Hi, Chris.
Hello, Dolly. Preston, good to be back again. And I'm looking forward to it here. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry about the long introduction.
No, I was innocent. I thought, who's he talking about? It can't be me. But when the years go by and you know, you do a few different things, and I guess sounds like somebody I know anyway. But anyway, yeah. So where do we want to begin?
Well, I'm hoping that most of you guys out there watched our previous show, but some are probably new here. We always get some new visitors. So just maybe start by saying a little bit about yourself and your research into.
Like it says in the bio, I research cases, classic, and you name the ones I'm most famous for, most notably Shag Harbor, although the Shelburne story is catching up. I live in Nova Scotia, and by the way, notice the great amount of people you had there that were from Scotland in your audience. And for anyone whose Latin isn't up to scratch, Nova Scotia means New Scotland.
That's right.
Right.
Oh, that's right.
And there is a real Scottish heritage here at the other end of the province. I'm just about dead in the center, but toward the Cape Breton end, Antigonish area of the province, there you have Highland games there, and of course the tradition of pipe bands and music, and there is that connection. But the name of the province actually means New Scotland.
Wow.
Okay. So, but. Yeah, well, one of the things I found lately, like for those, I don't think there's a need, or if you don't feel like, to recap the cases as such, but one of the recent things that has happened, like in my ongoing work in the Shelburne case, which, being the older of the two, is very much an active case, right? And for anyone who doesn't know, this is a case of two USOs that were sitting on the seabed of Shelburne Harbor back in October of 1960. And there was a NATO task force there that was there for training, the kind of training they did with proximity mines, a lot of minesweepers, but a few other actual warships there. And there were 10 US vessels and 8 Canadian vessels and a large dive platform. And while they were there, they claimed to have encountered actual entities in the water around two USOs.
Wow.
They sat there. It was kept secret at the time, and it was easy to do. Although it's back in the 60s, in that classic period, and people think, okay, aliens, waters, military, it couldn't be any more different from the Shag Harbor incident, because in the Shag Harbor incident, that was very open. And the world was very different here in Canada between 1960 and 1967. And back in 1960, this case happened out of sight of the public. I mean, when you're out at the mouth of Shelburne Harbor, you're about 10 miles from the town. There were no eyes. It all happened completely underwater. And they managed to keep the lid on this for a long time. And it was only due to my research on the Shag Harbor incident that I kept finding little things that didn't seem to connect to it, and people that tried to join these two stories. I mean, when I first started looking into the Shelburne incident, when I first heard of it in 1994, it was already like, 34 years old. And it took me another 29 years to make the breakthrough to free it from Shag Harbor and to put sense onto it.
Isn't that amazing how such a big case can remain hidden for so long?
Well, yeah, that's right. And I think there's a very important lesson in there for all researchers, because there are a lot of people that say, oh, the government can't really keep secrets. Well, it does. Yes, it can, at least for a time. And when you think about it, here's one that came so close to slipping permanently into what I call the dustbin of history, because the thing is, if I had not been so thorough in Shag Harbor and interviewed all the divers and the brass, the people in uniform, the defense ministers, had traveled to Ottawa on a grant from the Fund for UFO Research. And even then, I all I know was there was something there that wasn't just connecting right. And people, sometimes there were little signs when somebody say, no, I'm not sure that was part of Shag Harbor, but I heard about this and I thought it was like back around the Cuban Missile Crisis or before. And then when I eventually found people who had actually been on this mission, they claimed not to remember the names of the ships or didn't want to get involved. Most people just closed the door on me. But I was lucky enough to break through, to be persuasive, and to get through to this case. But it took me 29 years, and that's what the book is about. And I know, the book is done well on Amazon, but the thing is, a few people were a little disappointed, and I warn anybody up front now, the first half of the book is all the things I did that didn't work. But I think it's a lesson for researchers, and having an open mind. And that oldest of lessons, I always like to pound home there when I'm trying to talk to young people or people getting in the field is persistence pays off. You've got to
Yes.
follow your gut, your instinct, and you just keep going at it, right? And, sometimes it can be very discouraging. There were certainly points in that 29 years when I was the only one who was adhering to this belief that Shelburne was entirely separate from Shag Harbor and earlier. I mean, and it was discouraging because in Shag Harbor there was a paper trail that was easy to access, right? There was, film footage in CBC archives in Ottawa, the underwater search. It was very open. And like I say, you got to remember, even though both those years are 1960, it's a different planet here between 1960 and 67. In 1960, people still had trusted their government. You can't imagine that nowadays. In
Right.
67, that was gone.
All right.
After
Well, now that the book has come out, you can take that and go to the people who wouldn't talk to you before, knock on the door and say, "Liz."
That's what you would think, though. Yes.
Right.
But what I'm finding right now, one of the things, just about every year when I'm down in presenting annually at the UFO Expo, that both of you are going to be attending and presenting at this year in Yarmouth.
Yep.
Yeah, in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, you're coming here, and I can't wait to meet you in person. And that's taken a few years. There's things got in the way, and we've had that happen with other great guests that we've had. But we've kind of had a tradition of making sure you get here in the end,
Yep.
and we're persistent, yeah. But the thing is, like every year, I try to promise the crowd something about what I'm working on next on these cases and what has advanced from the year before, beyond the book or the latest documentary. And one of the things this year so far, I'm having a great deal of trouble with that I did not anticipate is that with the book out and with, additional evidence and eyewitness testimony and people within government positions giving more to me, the current people and powers to be in the Canadian government and in the U.S. government that had been helpful before, when I present them with Shelburne, it's a very different reaction than Shag Harbor. Suddenly their blood runs cold.
Wow.
They're like, yeah, we know what you mean, Chris. I don't think we can help this. You know what I mean? You've hit the hot potato here. You know what I mean? Like I say,
the tighter lip they become, the more secretive they become, the more it gives you pause to consider why,
Well, do you have evidence that people were threatened or, not told not to talk specifically?
Well, I not yet, but some of this I'm still piecing together. And let me show how these things overlap. One of the things I talked about last year when I was on stage down there, which is not in the book, is that when I was presenting on the stage there, I mentioned that I knew that there was something happened while I was researching Shag Harbor in the early days, and when I was first encountering this information on Shelburne, and I didn't know what at first. Again, I don't want to chew up all the time, but one of the things people are surprised about when I present largely on that case, so we had more time, and is that when I first discovered it, a lot of people would think, well, that must have been very exciting. Now you got live aliens in the water. Oh, I hated it. Because, really? Yes, I did. I thought, oh, God, not this. And the reason is that at that time, Shag Harbor was unfolding and it was becoming so great. And I thought, I'm going to avoid all the pitfalls that happened in a case like Roswell. I wasn't going to end up at 2 or 3 locations and conflicting witnesses, and, no, it wasn't this, it's here. And it was going that way. And then suddenly there was a fly in the ointment.
Right.
And everybody thought that would, and a lot of the other researchers and people that had helped me earlier on, colleagues, co-authors, film directors, and that, they had trouble understanding that. And I thought, no, there's something here that isn't quite fitting. And I didn't like it at all. But I quickly realized too, I mean, remember, I was pretty green then. I just gotten into this. It was my first involvement. I hit this great big case that seemed to have depth to it. And I made lots of mistakes, but I think I learned from them and I persisted and I kept going. But one of the things that puzzled me is by 1994, and this is pretty early on. I began in April of 1992. My first act of ufology was probably calling Stanton Friedman after watching a rerun, and he gave me some pointers, and I was on the way. But by 1994, I was contacted by a fellow who, and presenting live on the stage, I named names in this case last year for the first time. I was contacted by somebody that ran one of our member of parliament's offices in Ottawa, and I named him and the member at the time in the Liberal Party that he was working for. And this guy wanted to buy all my files and hand everything over, and he'd just take it from there and stop. And he offered me $50,000.
Holy smokes!
And what I knew then at the time was that there had to be something more here than Shag Harbor. Now, at the time, I didn't talk openly. I was new to this, and I thought, what happens if you talk about this? So I didn't include that. I just thought, well, that's just people will see it as gossip or bringing it down or trying to fan the flame or, put a little sizzle into something, right? Mm-hmm. But no, this had actually happened. And but it puzzled me because as I kept telling this person that contacted me from Ottawa was that, look, this stuff's all publicly available here in Canada. You just nobody before me had done the footwork or talked to the people. Oh yeah, that's great, but I don't want to have to run around and do that. And I seen what you did on sightings. I kept saying when you were working for Fox, I said I didn't work for Fox. It was Paramount. They were the distributor. This was still all new to me. And this guy was, no, well, I'm serious. Like, we'll have to talk, And he says, no, it'd be more like a figure like that. Because, he was saying, I'm not going to pay you like they did or whatever. But he was very persistent and serious. And I know when I first got the number, I called back to see it. And sure enough, it was the center block in the House of Commons, right? Mm-hmm. And, I asked about his position there, and they're saying, yeah. So, he was running the office for a Liberal member. And I thought, but I kept telling him at the time, I still have the phone book I'd written the numbers down in. And, eventually there were more and more numbers and cell phone numbers and pagers. He persisted for a while, but eventually gave up. And one day he said, well, are we going to do business or not? I said, well, I'm having so much fun here. He says, but what do you think you can do with it? What do you think? And I said, I'd like to think there's life after high school, I'm having too much fun and whatever. He says, you're not going to make any kind of money like that. I said, oh, probably not. I said, business is not my end of it, believe me, and eventually the call stopped. But
50,000 is quite a chunk of change.
This is in 94. And I'll tell you, I'm not sure how many more years it took. Well, I don't know if I've made 50,000 since yet, to be honest, in the years. But, he was pretty serious, right? And
you think he was trying to cover, basically buy out the story to cover it up?
Well, yeah, of course, that's not what he said, but he said he just wanted me to hand over all the files and he'd take it from here, and I would give up any rights to that or what I could do with it.
You feel like he might have been an agent trying to pull it from you, a government agent?
Well, he worked in Ottawa, like running the member's office there, Mm-hmm. But at first, like yourself, that's the first thing I'm asking myself, right? And then that just blew aside. And then what I'm wondering is, because he sounded serious and he sounded like he had some basic facts and, knew what he wanted. He was certainly persistent for, a few weeks there. And I thought, but why? As I explained to him, and it was clearly evident, and I was sitting there, I've never held this stuff to my chest unless somebody gives me some testimony and they demand anonymity, something I really discourage and rarely use, right? and have often come to regret the few times I've allowed it. Um, the question in my mind that started burning in and demanding my attention is why? What was so?
Maybe
Because
he wanted to
as
make a movie.
interesting as Shag Harbor was, yeah, but to me, there's something else here. Like something deeper, something more. And as I now know, that something else was Shelburne. And somebody in Ottawa thought if he keeps digging, if he gets lucky, if somebody has loose lips from back in that period that worked on both missions, with the naval career,
Yeah.
right? Maybe they did the basic research. I mean, maybe they realized at the time my father, who had served in one of these ships as a medic, I don't know, but it was just a possibility because despite the fact that Shag Harbor had kind of slipped into the dustbin of history, as I like to call it, also, things had been there'd been a paragraph or two in books over the years, and it was very public at the time. It was a front page story across Canada and went out on wire service around the world, kind of like Roswell did, right? And it just didn't make sense. But nobody knew about Shelburne up to this point. The lid had stayed on; it was airtight. And once I made the breakthrough in 2022, that 29 years later, after first hearing the telling of the story in a diver's home from someone who claimed to be part of the mission, actually they were hands on, um, it suddenly made sense. This was the fear that this is what would creep out, not Shag Harbor, which was undeniable. Shag Harbor was like rock and roll. It happened. You couldn't hide it away. There's nothing the CIA, the FBI, or the RCMP could do about it here in Canada, right? It was out there, right? You
Yeah.
couldn't pack it up.
A
But
lot of witnesses.
Shelburne was there. And you know what? When it first started leaking, and I would talk to other people and try to get their help, people all tried to connect it to Shag Harbor. They go, "Well, I think it's the end of the story, and they had the year wrong, and blah blah blah," and it got into that. And Ottawa was kind of like, "That's okay. They're going to have this so messed up and off, right?" But then once I finally was certain when the incident occurred and what ships were there and who was involved, and how serious it was, that this had triggered DEFCON 1, something that supposedly had never happened, even in in a specific geographic area in the field.
Have you had any major developments on the story since you put the book out? I mean, because an investigation never really closes.
No, it doesn't close. What's interesting is I wouldn't say a major development, but there's certainly the few developments that come forward have allowed for a lot more interpretation of the data I had, Preston. For example, one of the things now I'm even seeing there's articles and on things like even Wikipedia where it shows like one of these bases that was connected to the Shelburne base, which was again the coordination center for submarine detection back in the 60s for all the oceans of the world that hooked into the U.S. It had 64 SOSA stations and something else called the Mad Grid used to connect there and come ashore. It was a listing post, a high-tech listing post, with state of the art back in the day. And one of the things we now know is that, those bases were also used to store nuclear weapons, which actually violated a treaty they had with Canada. They were secretly stored there.
Yeah.
But they were also stored in Argentia, Newfoundland. But even now in the present, if you go to the right article, like on Wikipedia, I forget what it's called now. I think it's nuclear weapons in Canada during the Cold War or something. There are pictures they released of quite a stockpile of nuclear torpedoes and things like in the Argentia base in Newfoundland, right? But nothing yet about the Shelburne base. But I have a lot of detail about what was stored in Shelburne. There was a lot of like nuclear torpedoes, various types of specials. They even had apparently backpack bombs. There was a lot of movies I can remember in the early 60s about suitcase bombs and a great fear that somebody might come over here from one of the Warsaw Pact nations or in China, back in the day. How could you recover this bomb or detect it in downtown LA or whatever, right? But there never was a suitcase bomb, but there was a backpack bomb, weighed about 58 pounds, had a little plutonium core, and it was designed so that paratroopers could go out and attach it into a harbor and get out of the area, set a timer on it, right? This kind of thing. And these kind of bombs and training for them were occurring at different bases, Shelburne being one of them. Down in Key West, Florida, they would train divers how to deploy these weapons. And if you go down through the list of footnotes where these things are, I believe the article's called, it's about, they call them SADMs, SADM, Special Atomic Demolition Munitions.
Right.
And what's really cool is if you go down the bottom and you look at the footnotes, there's a couple of places where you can click and get video. And one of them actually shows them deploying these things, and it shows them opening one up and how to set the timer. And amazing details are released. Well, these were stored in Shelburne, right? I mean, just scary stuff when you think about what went on and what's kept secret from the public here, So these things have kind of, leaked out. And of course, so there are reasons beyond anything to do with the UFO phenomena or entities or that, although to my mind, that would be the bigger of the two. But there's these other things that were kept secret till now, I mean, it's like cases like, in the States, like with the CIA, when they tried to bring up the Russian sub out of the Pacific there. That's called Project, what was it, Amazonian, or I can't remember the name of the mission. But I mean, look how long it was before that came out in the film and the admission of it, right? Well, until I started digging into Shelburne and until I was able to peel that way and find the name of the mission, which is the title of the book, Sweet Flare 5, right? And, the story of these divers, nobody knew. I mean, it started with one man opening up to me and then me finding the others on the crew and getting one or two of them to talk and then calling a couple of the admirals and saying, oh, it was a long time ago. And one thing led to another. But eventually, once I had the names of the ships, I went and found the logbook in Ottawa for the command ship of the mission. And, with this date, I went back and looked on October the 12th, 1960. There it is. The mission stops. They sit over these things for 4 days, and they declared DEFCON 1.
They were probably really worried why they were paying so much attention to them, and it was ET would have been there paying attention to them because they have ever sought to bring up nuclear to everybody. In other words, to show everybody that they're there. And
this is only 2 nautical miles from the Shelburne base itself, which was at the time a U.S. base solely on Canadian soil. By 67 in Shag Harbor, one of the reasons we have more information is in 67, it was a 50-50 deal where we'd alternate commanders and Canadians worked on the base and Canadian Armed Forces. But in 1960, on that base, unless you were just the cook or, the guy that came to the gate and dropped things off, it was a U.S. only base under treaty, and you had to be U.S. personnel with the highest security clearance to work there. In fact, people have told me that had clearances higher than top secret, that when they had to visit that base, when they'd walk through the rooms where the plotters were, they would hold up sheets so you couldn't see the screens when, people that had that kind of security pass through, right?
Yep.
Do you have other Canadian cases that have such an overt nuclear connection?
No. And of course, that would be one other reason why, they would have preferred to keep this quiet, right? Now, most people hardly, it's long before our time, wouldn't care about that. But the story of the encounter in Shelburne Harbor in October 60, was completely unknown. But I mean, when I see how many people knew about it, and people I've talked to that, with the rank of admiral that admitted to it, many of those weren't on the mission. Unfortunately, the admiral who designed that mission and was deceased before I had a chance to. By the time I discovered his identity, but I talked to one of his best friends that had served with him, who was a commander of one of our aircraft carriers too, at the time of this mission, and he was. He was very open about it. Yeah, it happened. I wasn't there. Our ship was coming down the St. Lawrence, but these kind of guys would all talk about it. At that level. That were amongst the brass. And
do you have anything like the Freedom of Information Act that we have here?
oh, yeah, yes, we have an Access to Information Act, but I don't think this stuff would have ever been released like to archives and would have been. I've often said, you get 6 levels of security in the Canadian system. From unrestricted, restricted, confidential. You move up and you get to top secret. But the most important level, Preston, is really the one where you ask about something or you put in a formal request and they come back with, yeah, that number doesn't make any sense. We don't really know what you're talking about. If you don't know what you're talking about, then you can't get it reviewed by the Information Commissioner. It's not subject to court procedure, because what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Well, it's my understanding a lot of UFO incidents never get any paper trail whatsoever. They don't write it down, at least not publicly.
Yeah, that's right. And you don't have this huge paper trail with Shelburne, but what we have is this consistent eyewitness testimony, but in bits and drabs, right? Because there's people, and the people who talked and the people who've known are those who, you couldn't keep it from. Somebody's in command. Well, they have to know what they're doing and what the threat level is, right? Somebody is in charge. The other people you can't hide it from is the divers in the water, the people that are in hands-on position, the weapons tech, right? The divers, these kind of things. The medical staff dealing with injuries and, fallout. Yet at the time, duty and the attitude of 1960s, this one stayed airtight. And remember, there was no public viewing of this. It all happened underwater, 10 miles from where a community would view it, So, but interestingly, when you look at a place where there could have been a spillover, like a nearby manned lighthouse from the day, those logs would be missing. You know what I mean? So
of course,
there was that kind of cleanup and coordination, right?
Yeah.
However, amazingly, when I got the logbook of HMCS Cape Scott, which was the command ship of the mission, and it was a Canadian ship in charge because we were in Canadian waters, right? There was only a 12 nautical mile limit in those days, and we were well within it there. So, it was kind of our baby for command. And when I got the logbook for that time frame, I was shocked to find, again, it doesn't discuss aliens, whatever. Deck logs are very dry reading. You can blow up an enemy ship and, it might talk about that, but they never mention the gory details, right? Very dry reading, deck logs in your Navy or mine. And I've read a lot of U.S. ones too,
Well, we know there's a file somewhere on this incident. I mean, people, they take this subject so very seriously at high levels. We know this.
But
it depends on what they recover. Okay.
Yeah.
If it's something that they have to absolutely deny, period, the end, and you're never going to know about it, you won't know about it.
Well, they did film this incident underwater.
Okay.
And I talked to the man who actually did the filming, and I know where the film ended up. It was driven to Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, not far from where I live, like about 10 miles from here.
Okay.
Yeah, OGG is actually asking about that. There's mention in the book that there's footage.
Yes.
Where do you think that it's gone? And is it not possible whoever took it went back to the site and got more?
No, they were on active duty. They were a sailor, and they were a clearance diver that also had a specialty in underwater naval photography. And again, that's not just when they told me those details. I went to something we have here in the libraries in Canada called Might City Directory, and it's something that was like the phone book, but it actually told where people lived and what their job was. And when I looked up this gentleman, I grabbed the copy for 1960, it had him listed as active service, clearance diver, what ship he was on, which was HMCS Cape Scott, and it said underwater naval photographer specialty. So he was who he said he was. It'd be pretty hard to fake. Um, and the thing is that they drove this and they gave it to the Naval Research Establishment on Grove Street in Dartmouth, a facility that's still there. It's been rebranded a few times. It's now known as Defense Research Atlantic, part of our defense research establishment here in Canada, one of 13 facilities across the country. What's interesting, though, is they have a unique setup here in the Navy, because we were actually doing naval research, including on things like UFOs, during World War II in 1942 in the Canadian Navy, right? Which is, not a lot of attention. Everybody focuses on the Air Force, right? One of the joys that the Navy had here, and I think this is the case in the U.S. too, really, not a lot of researchers have considered this, is that they weren't burdened with having to deal with the public and explain sightings and do press releases. They just did their own research, because, when they'd have an incident, right, as they do nowadays with the Tic Tac sightings and the Go Fast encounters, right? I mean, but at the same time, the Navy, until recently down there, and never here in Canada, as it had to deal with public questions or complaints, right? So it just does its own thing.
We had the Project Blue Book here, which basically was to interface with the public. And in Canada, what did you have? Project Magnet, I think?
Well, yeah, but after that, and during the time of Shag Harbor and for a fair bit of the 60s, we had a division in Ottawa that was called the Air Desk. And it was part of Defense Headquarters. And when you look at, like, say, the newspaper coverage of the Shag Harbor incident back in October 67, you'll often see they quote Squadron Leader William Bain, who was one of the heads there and one of the investigators that ordered the underwater search in Shag Harbor, as they got reports from the Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax and the Mounties and, the aftermath, right? But they were a division of the Air Force, and they did very serious investigations. To put it in perspective, I've studied that period in Canadian history quite a bit. In 1967, there were 256 cases that were reported to the Air Desk from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police or city police forces, right? 9 were warranted to have on-site investigations. Shag Harbor, Falcon Lake, Manitoba, the famous landing case with Stephen Michalik would have been another. That's right, Stefan Mahalik, depending the more correct pronunciation.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. You must have been talking to Chris Rakowski. He would correct you on that. But, yeah, he did a great investigation on that. But the thing is, there were 9 cases that warranted on-site investigations. They would send men. There'd be hardware if need be, divers, a helicopter. It wasn't just the filing system like how Blue Book became. The unfortunate thing, though, is that because of Shag Harbor and cases like that, the next year, that kind of research was taken away from the military and given to Canada's National Research Council, right, for what they deemed serious scientific study, okay? And it was that in the beginning. There were 2 scientists particularly that ran with it, Professor Tennyson at the University of Toronto and Rupert H. McNeil, a geologist based here in Nova Scotia at Acadia University in the Annapolis Valley. And they were quite serious, but as they moved on in their career and eventually retired, the people who replaced them weren't near as serious. Now, these guys were provisioned, since it wasn't the military directly, to call on field units as they need them, but they rarely did. And eventually the system broke down over the years. And by 1999, they officially said they weren't even receiving reports, and at that point, like Blue Book, it had just become a filing system. But back in the 60s, they were very active. I interviewed those men. I went to Ottawa and interviewed Bain face-to-face about Shag Harbor and other cases. He was very interesting. He was very open, claimed he'd had sightings himself while flying Sea King helicopters off the coast of, get this, Shelburne. And when I showed him what I had about the Shelburne case at the time in Shag Harbor, he looked at me and he says, I don't know. He speculated a number. That one of the first things he said is, we might have got stick handled by the Americans on that one. Happened before, you know. But they were very open and helpful. And I found some correspondence between him and the colonel and the defense minister one day. And when they transferred the task of UFO investigations away from them and gave it to NRC here, National Research Council, I came to know all the writing. And in the column of one of the documents, and it's preserved in National Archives, he wrote, I think when I retire, I'll write a book and call it The Power of Negative Thinking. You know, he said, honestly, we shouldn't give this up. We're doing good work. And the Royal Canadian Air Force, was very open about it. However, our Navy, like I say, had a long history of looking into these things. And in fact, when you see the documents that I often show in my slideshow, right, my PowerPoint, right, you'll see these military telexes, the primary, communication form of the day. And when you see a UFO report, including a typical Mountie report, which is a format they used to call the HQ 400Q5 format, you'll see like all the military jargon at the top and and I could decipher all that stuff. I've become quite familiar. And at the bottom, you'll always see it, like, for example, in Shag Harbor, a big 120 that looks like it was written with a smudgy bowling alley pencil, that kind of greasy, right? That was the Navy's filing system. The Air Force would have, all this huge encoding and whatever. And of course, they were dealing with the public. The Navy just have UFO case 120.
Well,
right?
I want to pop up this question because this is exactly what you're talking about. This is from Bob Thorson, and he's asking, do you think the Canadian government is more transparent or more secretive than the U.S. when it comes to this subject, UAPs? Because you did have Paul Hellyer, of course.
Okay.
Sir.
Okay.
We haven't had that. Our defense minister said, what? Roswell?
Okay.
Malmstrom?
No.
Never heard of it.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you kind of a complex answer. It's probably a little different than others would give it to you. We used to be much more transparent. We no longer are. In fact, we're largely silent now. Okay. And there are a bunch of reasons for that. Officially, there isn't a division that actually researches this within the government or military, but in fact, there is, of course, and it's handled directly by military intelligence, and when necessary, probably from groups like there's an offshoot of our special forces there. Our renowned special forces here, which U.S. have often used on special missions, like in Afghanistan and other wars they were in, JTF2, they have another division called, get this, JTFX, and that's official. I have copies of their coat of arms, right? I remember I'd ask Ottawa about it. Here's an example when you asked me about the Access Act, and I'd ask if there was such a division, and could I have a copy of their coat of arms or the shoulder patch for the men? No, they didn't know what I was talking about. One day I went trolling through the Governor General of Canada's website, and then I looked at all the patches she'd approved, and didn't I find one there for JTFX, right? So one hand knows not what the other does in government, right? But no, we used to be much more open. We no longer are. We largely claim to be distant, and we largely are. But there are divisions, that have to deal with this from time to time, but they largely don't connect or admit anything to the public. Now, in terms, we mentioned Paul Hellyer in the past. Yeah, Paul Hellyer, when I talked to him, he was like, he wanted a copy of my books, and he was very friendly in that. He was still in that period where he used to say the only reason he had interest in it was because he read the book the day after Roswell. Okay.
Wow.
And because what I can tell you is that while he was defense minister, he had little to do with it. It was one of the few periods in history when we had two defense ministers at once. You never hear about the other guy. He was Leo Cadieux. And all the UFO things, including this transfer to NRC and all the things that were sent about active cases, went to Leo Cadieux. And the closest I could ever find that Paul Hellyer was involved with the UFO case was when he where they had this sort of, we used to have these silly centennial projects when Canada was 100 years old in 67. And one of them was somebody built a UFO landing pad. It's still a touristy site. Yeah, he went there to cut the ribbon with Mother Teresa. I don't know how that worked. Yeah.
That's
no, Paul Hellyer, was, he had quite a career as a politician, but it was a very unusual one. But he just didn't, he was our defense minister. He made great changes within the defense system. He really didn't have an interest or a lot of involvement with UFOs at the time. His interest came later. And when I talked to him, he seemed very open about that. And I've heard in some of his presentations. I think the way he presented that changed a little in the end. And, but like I say, the person at the time, the name I keep running into all the time that was on all the documents on active cases, for example, when they went to Shag Harbor, they had to get clearance because, like I said, that year they did on-site investigations with military resources. Well, that always means money. So who gets to release the money? Well, somebody had to decide, and I would find the signature of Leo Cadieux on it, never Paul Hellyer. And they were both called associate defense ministers. At the time, we still had a large military. As you know, we have a very small one now, that President Trump likes to, throw darts at, of course, understandably, because we don't spend a lot on defense. And but at the time, we still had a 60-ship Navy for a country at the time that wasn't 20 million. It was fairly respectable, and we were, a fair player in World War II. But over the years, that had diminished and diminished. The felt the need wasn't there for it. And the purpose of the Canadian Navy all through that period, very much in the 60s, we had one single mission, basically. There were other little support things as necessary, like rescue or whatever. The mission of the Canadian Navy was anti-submarine warfare. Of course, in the Atlantic Ocean was the primary, and a little bit in the Pacific, But so I hope that answers the question. Like I say, we used to be very open. We're less open. Paul Hellyer didn't have a lot to do with it. I'm not trying to dismiss everything he said. He certainly became active in it, was a proponent for disclosure in his later years, but more when he was out of government than in it. You know what I mean? I met him, and he was a very supportive guy, and that to that movement, I think, and quite honest. So, but at the time that he served, most of that work in the department, and it's been largely unsung, fell to his associate minister, Leo Cadieux.
Wow. So you were talking about in the green room. You found an interesting case that you worked on, or what was it? An article?
What was that again? The last you kind of glitched out on me just for the last couple words there.
Yeah, we were talking in the green room about what we're going to talk about because we already
haven't even got to that yet. Eh?
No, we're on our second hour, so I figured.
Okay, we better get there. Yeah, better get busy. Yeah. One of the things that's fascinated me and particularly did throughout the 90s and early 2000s, I did a lot of work on this. I'd find these other UFO cases while I was working on Shag Harbor, particularly just by accident, because, I'd find things from the same time frame. And, people like Stan Friedman were really great. He'd loan me boxes of documents he'd never had a chance to go through that he would get in bulk from National Archives, as it was known at the time, now Library and Archives Canada. And occasionally I'd find things in there. And a lot of these were old police reports, Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And they were a great starting point to reinvestigate cold cases, because back in the days, it was a great filter when you think about it in that sort of age where, somebody, before they pick up the phone and call the police, they must be pretty sure they're seeing something, right? And in some cases, something quite unusual. And let's start by looking at one of these cases and why it fascinated me. Going through these documents that Stanton had loaned me till the next time I seen him, I found a nice curious one-page RCMP report, and it's become known as the Webster sighting. And what happened? This is back in October 1976. Always seems to be October here. These good cases, probably simply because we have clearer skies. I mean, weather in Nova Scotia. Wow, it can change quick here.
Well, no, there's some October is super active in 1973, the year of the humanoids.
Yeah, yes, I remember that.
In
Yeah,
France, 1954, October,
yes,
huge wave. I don't know,
yeah.
maybe there's something to October.
Well, maybe there is, but here's the But look at that. Shelburne was in October in 1960, October 12th. Shag Harbor, October the 12th, 4th, 1967.
Wow.
And this case I'm about to tell you was in October, right? Anyway, we're a little newer here. We're up into the 70s, and we're in the community of Lower Sackville, Nova Scotia, which is a bedroom community and suburb outside Halifax, Dartmouth, the capital and the center of our small province. And what happened is a woman there, a Mrs. Percy Webster, calls the nearby RCMP detachment in Bedford, Nova Scotia, near midnight, and says, could you send an officer to the house? There's a UFO over my house, and I'm not feeling too good about it. It's been there quite a while. So they dispatch an officer to the house, and when he arrives, he knocks on her door, and he says, yes, if you want to come outside, look, there's actually 3 UFOs over your house.
Wow.
Right? So they're still there, and she steps outside. And according to the officer, the way he writes this report, there's 3 of them, and they're what we would now call tic-tac shape. He used the word lozenge shaped, but they were in 3 sections. The middle section you could see into, and he described it as kind of like a tea strainer, and there was a green light moving around inside. There was a red and white light on the bottom. There's no noise. They're hovering there over the house, right? And he hangs around there at the property for 2 hours, and they're there the whole time. He calls a nearby military base at Shearwater, which is less than a mile from where I live nowadays, and they tell him they're not painting anything on the radar. And
how high up were they?
500 feet, he estimated in the report.
What year?
This is 1976, again, the month of October. And he calls Halifax International. They're not painting anything. He also radios from his cruiser in the driveway over to other cars in the distance that are on high ground, and they can see them from their position clearly too. And they're all looking at them through binoculars. He stays there. She brings him coffee to the front lawn, and they're talking about it and watching. And when he's after 2 hours, he says he has other duties to perform. He said, well, they seem to be getting a little higher, if anything, the way. And he said, I have to go. He said, if you feel at all threatened or something changes, call us back. We'll come back.
So nobody scrambled the Air Force, nothing?
No.
Yeah.
So
can I tell you a secret? Those were not ET.
Sounds like reverse engineered. Yeah, I'm thinking.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm not going to say what they were or weren't, because I don't know. But here's what happened. Here's where the case really starts to change, though. So he leaves, and he writes it up, and it's this nice, neat little page. And it's unusual that here's an officer there. Others see it from the distance in uniform on duty. There's no noise, blah, blah, blah. And, he says, I looked at it, and I'm convinced it wasn't anything distant or astronomical or conventional aircraft. He signs the report. And in the last sentence of the report, he mentions the neighbors who are also witnesses to the report. So I kind of like this, and I thought, well, I'm always driving through Sackville or going out to visit a friend of mine. I stuck it on the fridge with a fridge magnet. And I thought the next time I'm headed out there, I'll put it in the car, and I'll just knock on this person's door, because this report was before the Privacy Act here kicked in, and it had the street address and the phone number and everything, right? And I thought, no, I'm just going to, yes, I see that there. I got a comment. Tim Gallaudet, yeah, that's the guy you want to recommend your book, I'll tell you.
You actually mentioned my book too, so.
Yeah, he's a good fellow, and open-minded too, and he had a great career there in the U.S. Navy, right? Anyway, back there. So one day I was headed out there, and I went up and I just knocked on the door unannounced, and Mrs. Webster answered the door. And I told her who I was, and she said, "Oh, come in. I'd love to talk to you."
Nice.
So I talked to her, and she basically told me what was in the report without any embellishments, nothing. I asked a number of questions, and
Mhm.
I kind of just sort of social questions I always ask too, like, like, do you think you'll ever see one again? Oh, we thought we were seeing things. We kept looking, but we thought we did several times, but no, I don't think so, and I don't think we'll be that lucky. Now, her adult son had still lived with her at this point, and he had been a witness at the time. I think he was still in high school then. Her husband had passed on. So I asked her about the neighbors. I said, list them. I said, do your neighbors still live next door? Oh, Chris, she said, would do you any good to talk to them? She said, there's some kind of Christian cult or something. I don't know, she said, but they're not going to talk about it. We don't much get along with them, but she said, I don't think they're there anyway. Every summer, I think they go to Ontario or go on vacation, and their car's not been around for a while. And I said, well, thank you for the warning, but in the interest of completeness, I'll go knock on the door and give it a try. Well, I got no answer, right? So I went back home, stuck it back on the fridge with the fridge mate, and once a week I dialed the number. And after about 3 weeks, somebody picked up the phone. It was a male voice. And he says, hello. And I started by saying, hey, don't worry, this is not a sales call. I told him my name, identified myself, and said, I'd like to talk to him. I guess you were a witness to a UFO sighting back in 1976. Now, this is around 94 when I'm calling him. Okay. And he says, whoa, buddy, I'm going to stop you right there. He said, I've never seen anything like that. Oh, I said, really? I said, well, that's curious. I said, going to have to ask you a few questions because your name's in this Royal Canadian Mounted Police UFO report. I said that you've been interviewed. He said, when was this again? And I told him October 1976. He said, I don't even think we lived here then. And I hear him hollering for his wife, hi, where are you at? And I can hear this woman come up the hall. Turned out he was on a wall phone in the hallway, a landline at the time in the 90s. And he's asking her just repeatedly, what she's going, who is it? Who's that? Just tell me. He goes, when did we move down here from Ontario? And she said, the fall of 76. Well, he comes back at me. He goes, I guess we're here, but I don't. And I can hear her saying, who is it? What is it? Oh, he says it's the Websters next door. I guess they've seen a UFO or something. And I can hear his wife start saying, dear, that was the night, the night. The next thing you know, I can hear this hand on the phone, and you just hear, he's covering the phone. Then he comes back on and he says, yeah, I know what you're talking about now. I said, so you did see a UFO? No, I did not, he said. Well, I said, I'm sorry. I said, can you explain what you mean? And he said, yeah, he said, and I regret saying what I said about our neighbors. He goes, you understand, we don't much get along with the neighbors. I didn't tell them I've been warned, He said, and he did say, he said, I'm a Christian and I shouldn't be talking like that. But no, we don't get along. I'm sorry, but I know what you're talking about. And no, we didn't see anything. And he said, I've been trying to forget it. But the truth is, he said, me and the wife were hiding under the bed.
Wow.
And I said, what were you hiding from? He said, well, the house was shaking and the noise was so loud. Now, in the report, they're standing on the front lawn outside and there's no noise.
That's odd.
And it's right next door to them. You could throw a pebble and hit the house, right? So, of course, I asked questions around that. And he said, no, we thought we were going to die. He said, if you think I'm just overreactionary or something. He said, I'm a naval architect in the Canadian Navy.
Oh, there you go.
And he says, I fly in Sea Kings and Labradors all the time. He says, I don't know what this was over the house, but it was low. But he said, I didn't want to know. He said, we just hit under the bed and we were just hoping it would stop. He says, honestly, it sounds silly to say it aloud. He said, but we thought we were going to die or something. He said, it was bad.
Did the other witnesses report hearing any noise?
No noise whatsoever. So this went, and I've since found other witnesses to this that night that were outside and they heard nothing. People that were just walking down the street from her corner store that used to be open all night, and things like that. Anyway, I said, so I still don't see how your name got here. And what I said, how did it end? And he said, well, that's the funniest part. It just went on and it just stopped like you flip a switch. And he said, as soon as that stop occurred, I could hear somebody knocking at the door. And that's when I went downstairs and there was the RCMP officer. He says, I looked out past him over his shoulder and I could see the Websters on lawn. He wanted us to step outside, but I didn't. He said, and I wouldn't go out. So I guess that's how he got my name. I must have given it. But he said, we didn't step outside to say it, but we heard it. So what was that?
Two conflicting stories. People there, an officer there, you got to ask yourself who is messing with who. That's what you got to think about. You have to think about dividing them up into the two categories they're in. I heard it, I didn't. And then you do personality profiles on everybody and find out if they were outside.
Yeah, but how do you pull that off? How do you get one to?
Because
Right.
they have ways, and I'm telling you, they have ways. And
Who the police?
the government does. And it's
Wow.
amazing what they can do to you. I'm serious as a heart attack. It's amazing what they can do to you. And the guy inside, I would go to his story faster because of who he is and what he said, because he's an authentic witness. In other words, he's a trained observer. Architects are the best observers of everything there is. They're the best truth tellers. And what he did, that was dead up honest. And I think the others were messed with. That's what I think. And I think it was an executed aerial flight of a known phenomena from the military. That's
certainly an unusual case either way. But,
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, Dolly, at the time, for anybody before me, and since, for that matter, that just goes through the files in Ottawa, at National Archives and finds this, right?
Yeah.
They're only getting that half of the story.
Right.
Nobody was expecting me to go and knock on that door.
Yeah, well, see, that's
I gave no warning.
Yeah.
These people did not like each other or trust each other.
Yeah. You're the one that found the
in one sense, it's so pure, this case, right?
Well, that's the kind of research we need, boots on the ground, verifying.
Well, that's right. And that's why these old police reports, I find, they're a great start to reopen a cold case, right? Because it's a filter, because you're going to find something unusual, right? And I've had other cases like this where I found these, not all as dramatic, but interestingly, before this happened, I wrote an article in MUFON. Now, I was coming at it from a different angle. Bear in mind, it's early on, and I'm not saying I'm right and you're wrong, but without even knowing all this, I was writing about the Val-E concept here about reality transformation, as he likes to call them. And I put in this, that it was an article I called Factors of Conditional Probability, which is about some of the things you may encounter when you find these sightings where things just aren't adding up, right? That are kind of kooky. And I put, a short list of these traits would include such features as morphing, disproportionate hysteria, entity encounters, miraculous cures, or cases demonstrating inexplicable lacks of corroboration among large eyewitness pools connected to a specific simultaneous event.
Yeah.
But then in reality, I start running into these cases. Now, these are rare. Like if I look into 20 police cases, right?
Yeah.
You might find one. You know what I mean? But they've all kind of come up like this, is that I come at it and, no one's expecting me to come back. Nobody here looked for publicity. Nobody, like in this case, this was one of the best cases. Like these people didn't like each other. They weren't going to put anything up, And, when this was unfolding and these people are telling you and you see them emotionally distraught all these years later, it makes the hair stand up on your neck.
Like your neck. Right.
This is their reality. You're not going to, and these cases are out there and they don't get a whole lot of attention. And I don't know. For me, that's the real payoff. Yeah. I mean, that $50,000 would have been nice if I'd gone away. But I'll tell you, it's those moments when you're up against it. The only thing that's better is like when I was on Cape Sable and you actually see something happen like that.
Yeah.
You're there in the daytime with 60 people around you, which I've been lucky, and that's for what. The years and years of chasing things and usually getting there and thinking, oh, you should have been here earlier and it got away. But that one thing was a payoff. But these cases, when you find these people and they tell you this stuff, I mean, there's no way anybody could cook this up if there's any deception from the individuals involved,
Yeah.
and it's just amazing, right? Now, I've seen cases like this where the trauma is so deep. We have a case in Shag Harbor from 1970, 3 years after the crash incident, right? So-called crash, controlled ditch, whatever you want to label it. And what happened was there was a pair of brothers there, and they had gone to a nearby RCMP detachment. This time it's November, not quite October, 1970, basically 3 years after Shag Harbor. And they went to report a daughter that had ran away from home, a teenage daughter, right? And they were concerned about that. UFOs were the last thing on their mind. The two of them were there, fill out a written report. One of the two brothers is a close friend, had become over the years there with the Mountie he was reporting it to. They used to go duck hunting together. They were trustworthy. They would use his fishing boat for rescues because it was well equipped. He had radar when the Coast Guard was already tied up with another rescue. Anyway, they report this missing daughter, and Officer Ralph Keeping tells the Smith brothers, Lawrence and Eugene Smith, to go back home. She'll probably turn up. She's ran away once before.
How old is she?
The
time?
I forget her exact age. I'm not sure it says that in the report. She would have been like 16, 18 or something, living at home, but left with some boyfriend or whatever. Yeah, not really young. Yeah, well, not like an abduction case of somebody, of a young child, really. No, it's not that kind of scenario. But they were still concerned, that she was in high school, I think, still, or whatever. Anyway, on the way back, the men are heading toward Shag Harbor on Old Highway 3 that traces the coast. They come around a bend in the road between what's known as the two Bear Point roads, a crescent road that runs off. Back in the day, there were no houses in this section. There was nothing there. And it was foggy out. And when they come around the bend, at first they see a light. And he goes, Lawrence, what's that? And then instantly a bunch of lights light up. And it looks kind of almost like if you had to describe the pattern, because they drew pictures, roughly looked like the Big Dipper or something, just in this shaped scatter pattern of lights across the road. And what they first thought when they saw it, each one of these things was about 18 inches across. And they thought because of the fog that maybe a tractor trailer had jackknifed and flipped on its side and was across the road. So they stomp on the brakes and the truck comes to a stop and stalls. And they're looking at the lights and they realize there is nothing there, just these lights floating in the air. And they start to feel a pressure on their chest. And they can't seem to move, and they're held there for what they estimated to be only 30 seconds. And suddenly the lights disappear. Well, they're terrified. They turn around, they go right back to the RCMP detachment they left to file the report of the missing girl. They start telling Ralph Keeping, the officer on duty, what they happened. He drives back with them to the site, looks around with a flashlight, asks them questions. He's watching them. They seem extremely upset. They're vomiting and everything, one of them, and nausea, and they're swearing to him that they will never drive through this road again. Well, that would make life almost impossible.
Well, just backing up a little bit, were these lights very low to the ground?
Yes.
All right. And how close were they? How close were they to them?
Well, the estimates vary, but like treetop level.
Okay.
That kind of thing.
25, level. 50 feet. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's all kind of interesting. He tells them to forget about it and go home, and they go, we'll never forget about it. He can't understand why they're so upset. Yes, it's odd to be a little, but it seems to him, like I've said in this article of these kinds of cases, an overreaction, tells them to go home. They tell them they'll never drive on that little strip of road again. And they don't. What they do is every day, if they're coming to the highways, they take the Bear Point road to avoid it. It adds like 6 kilometers to the trip every day, to avoid that spot.
Have you ever been in an MRI?
No, but I used to work I've been in rooms when they've been given.
So that you become slightly weightless in the thing when you're in it. Okay, your weight changes while you're in it, and that's why they've developed one that's more open, but you're still subject to that. Your body is lost some of its energy, and all your cells are turning upward. It's getting your cells to all stand on end, so they transmit out.
It's a huge magnetic field in an MRI.
That's right.
Right?
Well, can you imagine
one.
getting out and looking at something and walk into a magnetic field like that? Very first thing you're going to feel is pressure.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's going to make you nauseous. It's going to make you nauseous for a day or two afterwards. Some people get explosive headaches from it. Some people can't eat for a day, or whatever they eat comes back up gelled and weird and stuff like that. And so that's probably a very, very bona fide sighting, because close to a craft would do that to you. If you hit that field, also know that electrocharge on you, electromagnetic charge can grab you and hold you in stasis. It'll either blow you back or pull you forward. But sometimes if you're just barely touching it, it'll grab you and hold you in stasis.
Well, there's quite a few cases where people describe exactly this sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, anyway, they go home, and the Mountie the next morning is in the detachment writing up this report, and it would have been a 1-page report like that other one. But it ends up being an 8-page report because while he's there, the phone rings, and the NORAD commander of the nearby base at Backrow, Nova Scotia, this was that end of the Pine Tree line, a NORAD radar facility.
Yeah.
It's totally automated now. In the day, it was an actual base, right? Colonel Calvin Rushton, who I interviewed in his home about this. That's one thing I was very lucky. I've often had access to the actual people, right? Mm-hmm. The Mountie I interviewed, I brought him down to the community. He showed me the site. We talked. Calvin Rushton, I was in his home. Unfortunately, near the end of his life, he was dying of prostate cancer complications, and but they were very open about it. Anyway, Calvin Rushton, the commander of the base, calls him and asks if they had any UFO reports the previous night. Not something that happens every day, the man would say. And he says, well, I'm not sure I'd call it that. And he describes what the Smith brothers had experienced, right, between the two Bear Point roads to come off Highway 3. And the commander says, well, funny, we had the same thing happen here on the base out by the gates. One of my men, Timothy Nielsen, was leaving with his mother and girlfriend, and he seen it, and he was very shook up. And in fact, he came back and told them just to go home. And he stayed at the base all night so I could debrief him in the morning. Felt it was important, and it really has disturbed him, right, greatly. The exact same time. But this is 20 miles from the other incident.
Yeah.
The UFO flies 20 miles is what? 2 seconds?
Nothing. Yeah.
But anyway, the other thing that's interesting was when I began looking into this case in the 90s, right, some 20 years after it happened, when I first tracked down, it was hard to locate Lawrence Smith because there was a lot of Lawrence Smiths in the Shag Harbor. Smith is a big family name, and there are actually several clans of Smiths that are unrelated by blood, So, but when I found the right Lawrence Smith and I went to his home and I talked to him about it, when I showed him the RCMP report, because they didn't at first, I still thought it was important not to contaminate the witness, when he tells me it.
Yeah.
And when I showed it to him, he was shocked because he had remained friends with this even after, their retirement and that with this Ralph Keeping. And he never knew, and Ralph never told him of the other witness or sightings at the base or the rest of it. It became a point of contention between them and they stopped being friends. And when I brought the Mountie to the community, Lawrence left town, so it's not to face them. You realize in these small communities how sensitive it can be, right?
Yes, sure.
He just thought that his friend owed him the disclosure, And I asked him, why didn't you do that? He goes, oh, it's our training. He said, we don't do that. You know what I mean? Like, we don't volunteer.
No, was there any connection to this missing girl at all, or was that just incidental?
No, that was it. She turned up unharmed, and
Right.
there was no incident. But again, it's not every day that NORAD calls and asks, like, have you had UFO? And yes, you have. We don't know what it was, but it happened at our gates too. And then other people were turning up, experiencing the same thing at the same time, right? Now, this is different than the other case in that here everything is consistent, even in different locales, right?
Yeah.
And I eventually went on to write the paper about that there were, I think, 2 types of these. And I don't call them reality transformations like Valley does, but something seems to, whether it's from the phenomena or, as you may suggest, something more earthly, right? What I call controlled witness perception. And something by means unknown. This is what I pieced together with it at the end of that MUFON paper I published here in Canada years ago.
Yeah.
And it didn't get a lot of attention, except I get a lot of response in Europe from overseas, even the Vatican, about this. But Americans were kind of like so into the nuts and bolts at the time in the 90s, it kind of went under the radar, but
Right.
But when you find these cases, and like you say, the way the evidence comes out of them, when you reopen these cold cases, nobody was expecting me to ever come along. But see, this is what happens when you don't just Google things up. Hey, look, I do online research.
Yeah.
Look, you got to get out of the armchair.
You got to go to
get out there and press the flesh.
That's right.
You got to. And you know what? That's the real payoff. That's when that hair will stand up on your neck. That's when you see the depth and you feel the power even after the fact if you miss the event,
Right.
Yeah.
So
well, especially when you get confirmation from independent sources, you're like, wow, other people saw this.
Oh yeah, this is not hysteria. This is not anybody creating a story or seeking attention, like it's just
quite the opposite. They don't want attention.
No, they don't.
About what somebody else talked about, it's very flat. It's like reading a piece of paper. You're not getting anything out of it. But
That's
when you go straight to the horse's mouth, you get 3D, 4D even with sound effects. Sometimes the actual, and you get the emotion from them, and their mind
emotion. That's really
okay.
key.
The whole thing.
Thank you, Dolly. Let me put the icing on the cake on this case. There is more. I almost forgot this.
Okay.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. Here you go. This will make you pucker up. It's so sweet. When I interviewed the Mountie and Lawrence left town because he didn't want to encounter his friend that he was, upset with for not disclosing how much he really knew about the other incidents, right?
Mm-hmm.
We were talking to him, me and Don Ledger, I remember, and one of the things that came up is he said, I tried something that I didn't put in the report. Here it is. He said, they were so adverse, him and his brother Gene had said, that we're never going to stand in that spot again, no matter what, right?
Yeah.
He decided to test that theory, so he put him in the back of the RCMP cruiser on the floor and covered him with a blanket.
Oh my God.
And decided to drive around the area at random up and down. Now, you try that. That's pretty confusing. You can't tell where you are, right? And he wanted to see if he became apprehensive or have any sense when they were actually near the spot. And clearly there was.
Oh, wow.
And I thought that was quite brilliant. And I looked at that and I said, I like that. You'd have made a good UFO investigator. And Ralph said to me, you'd have made a pretty good Mountie, but I can't picture you, on a horse with it. No, God, don't go there. I said, but
they did this with the blanket over them. They didn't know where they were, but
they
immediately.
Well, he did it with one of the brothers, Lawrence, the one that he was personal friends with. He felt comfortable doing that. He said, I'm going to try something. And that's what and whenever he would start to approach it, like he would get panicky and start reacting.
Was this shortly after the incident then?
Yes. Yeah, a few days later.
You realize that humans can do what other animals can do. We just don't realize we're doing it. We have an ability to know where we are magnetically. Okay.
It was kind of brilliant. And,
Yeah.
and I'll just
Weird.
end it with this. Constable Ralph Keeping looked at me and he said,
Yeah.
and after we complimented each other, you'd have made a good man, you'd have made a good UFO researcher. He says, Chris, he goes, I don't know what that means, but it means something.
Yep.
And I would agree. And I would agree.
Absolutely
Wow.
agree with you
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. So
Absolute coordinate memory in his head, and he was not going to do it again.
that's the great
Absolutely.
stuff you find when you
Yeah.
get out of the armchair, when you get out there.
Yeah.
And I just can't stress that enough. Yeah. I mean, and I tell people, if you can't get there, if you're looking into a case that's too far away, that voice telephone call, you think about the Webster case, how much I wouldn't have heard his wife in the background saying, dear, that's the night.
Yeah.
And he would have just let it go. But the more intimate the communication, right? Of course, on the internet, if you're doing a Zoom, if you got the face, if you got
Right.
like that's good too. But
Yeah.
the more intimate the communication, but nothing beats the personal touch of
Yes.
being up close there with
Exactly.
them.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing. Have you had any really good entity cases? I always find those most interesting. I think you talked about one last time you were on.
Well, there's been a few, and by entity, what were you preferring to hear in terms of what I mean is like part of an abduction scenario or just
Well,
an
whatever, a case that comes to mind. I use the term entity because it's neutral, because people describe these as
yeah
humanoids or, oh no, they're extraterrestrials, or, I felt it was a spiritual experience. So,
yeah
but
well, I haven't had too many that describe a spiritual experience. Most of them are negative. I have had some though that have done that, right? um I'm trying to think of something different. Well, here's an interesting one we have from a member who was recently joined up, and somebody who had a background. I'll leave them unnamed for now, but they were a local person in the Yarmouth area where we're going to have the conference, right? And they had a very interesting case of where they were down near the water, sitting in a car, and it was a couple. And while they were there, a pair of bright lights appeared behind the vehicle, and they kept looking back, but they could never quite discern anything other than really bright lights. And all of a sudden, the vehicle started being pushed toward the water,
Mm.
like almost like it was going to go into the ocean. It was very frightening.
well, I can imagine.
And then the next thing you know, they're just sitting there and they're not sure what happened, and neither one spoke about it except for years later. Things like that. And this is a case of professional people, that I've had cases like that there. I've had cases too. Well, here, let me tell you something interesting. I've talked before, I think, about the sighting I had on Cape Sable there in 2018, where we have video, and I'm going to show you some of that when we're up and visiting in the room there. Like I say, I'm not the copyright holder, but there was press coverage of that here in Eastern Canada. It wasn't an international story, but we had 60 people with us on the beach. This was an hour and 20-minute sighting, in daytime, cloudless sky, a rare thing here in Nova Scotia. And but leave that one aside. I've talked about that before. When you talk about any encounter, I'm not sure this qualifies. I would put it in this, but maybe I shouldn't. In this case, they don't see it, but there's one heavily implied. The type of UFO we seen that day was, again, one of these spheres with the cube inside, like they were seeing in the Atlantic, off the carrier training off Virginia,
Mm-hmm.
And but before that happened, when I was filming the episode of Ocean Mysteries with the Cousteau grandchildren there, Celine and Fabian, we were in the Shelburne area. One day they didn't need me for filming, and I was heading into Yarmouth just to go in to buy some clothes and shop and that, since it was a down day in the filming process. And when I got right near the causeway that goes out to Cape Sable Island, I got a call from somebody there and wanted to know if I wanted to come out and hear the UFO story there. So I they called their timing was perfect. I just hit the left blinker light and turned left and went out to Cape Sable and met them at what's known as Daniels Head Beach.
Mhm.
And this woman, it was a drizzly, rainy day at the time that would clear later, and we did end up shooting in the end. But at that time, I'm just there hearing her story. And right when I locate the woman on the beach, uh, she was, I could tell before, as I'm walking toward her when I parked the vehicle, that she's in distress, in that, like, she's got Kleenex in her hand and she's sort of fumbling it and shredding it, and I go out and talk to her. And she was having difficulty at first, and I did my best to make her feel at ease, which I seem to do. And she told me the story about how earlier that year she had been at that same beach. She had just moved to the community and took a job in Yarmouth as a nurse at the hospital there. And she was trying different beaches and looking for a place, where she could enjoy the salt water in the ocean and, catch sun and that, right? And this day
Mhm.
she was there, and it was an early day here. I mean, when you get a warm day in Nova Scotia in June for sun, it's unusual. And she was off work, and it was a weekday, and there wasn't many people there, and she was enjoying this on her own. She had just left living in the city here, back where I'm at in Metro, and left a bad relationship and that behind, and was down here and was looking forward to the solitude, and just the sun and settling into the community. She
Right.
said she had a great day, and she just kept staying. I thought, oh God, finally we got a hint that there might be a summer here in this province. And,
Mhm.
she's hanging in. And eventually she realizes the few people that were there were dispersed, and she's the last person left on the beach alone, right?
Oh.
And she's laying there, and after a while she keeps getting this sensation that she's being watched, and she'd
Mhm.
sit up and look around, but nobody. And it happened repeatedly, and she'd sit up and look around, and nobody, right?
Mhm.
Hmm.
So it gets even stronger, and she'd been laying out flat for a while, and she'd actually forced herself to ignore it, thinking, no, I'm just being ridiculous. And she thought, well, I should be going home soon. And she sat up, and as she was lifting herself up from the prone position, lying down, she happened to glance upward, and directly over her, here was one of these spheres with a cube in it descending toward her.
Wow.
And like, she instantly panics, looks around, realizes there's nobody else, and just grabs one handful of her stuff, was going to leave the blanket and everything behind, and tries to run for her car, which was, maybe 50 feet away in this little parking lot by this Crescent Beach. And she manages to take a few steps and then just drops and falls face first in the sand and feels paralyzed.
Wow.
So the next thing she experiences is that, and she said, right away, it's like tachycardia, her heart's pounding. She thinks she's going to die, or be taken or something, right? Just because. And she said, I'd never had any interest in this before whatsoever. But, just when you do see those stories, that's what happens. And, she's just panicking, can't move, can't holler. There's no one there anyway, right? She said fear was just overwhelming. She figured, if something doesn't happen to me, I'm going to die just from the fright. Well, she could hear whispers in her ears, but they're completely unintelligible, just like a whispering sound, that made no sense. And it seemed quite close, but she never felt like there was anything there. Doesn't remember being touched, right? But they would be near the ears. And this went on several times and for some time. And once or twice she said, I might have been touched. And, she believes, just touching her clothes, like they were curious or something, is the way she put it.
Mm.
But she doesn't remember anything any more involved than that. And after what seemed like an eternity, she said suddenly she realized she could move, like when you were coming out of a lucid dream. But she insists it wasn't that, because she has had those. And at that point, she just gets up, grabs the keys, and just runs for the car and gets out of there. Keeps looking, never sees the sphere cube combo thing again, right? And just gets out of there and never went back. Found that she just couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't work on this new job, and has been unable to since, and wanted to talk to me and ask if there's somebody she could contact. was looking for somebody to help her through this, right? And that would be, again, it's an entity implied, not seen, but there was certainly, you could say at the very least, a UFO scene. But here's the thing, that spot where I met her and told me, this would have been while we were doing the shoot in, it was August of that year. In October of that year, when I get the call in Yarmouth and I go down to the daylight sighting where it is,
Mhm.
it was the exact same spot.
Hmm.
I'd never talked to anybody about it because at the time her privacy
Yeah.
and her quest for therapy and help through this was primary yet. And I warned her of the pitfalls of going public. I mean, you may be ready for that someday, and
Yeah.
she was, of course, understood and heeded that. So knowing how sensitive it is in the small community, I never even told the colleagues that I often work with in the area members. I kept her identity quiet. But the day that I got the call and went to Daniels Head Beach, that it's happening, it kept going through my mind as this was all unfolding. And I can remember looking around at one point when it was kind of close and none of our cameras or anything would work. I was like, I hope there's safety in numbers here, because, that went, but I was the only one standing there who knew that. And I remember one of the witnesses, Heather Doucette, who I hope to be writing a book about now, about her life experience as a repeat experiencer, and you'll get to meet her probably when you're down there, somebody who's a member of the group and whose case I find extremely credible. And she has certainly seen entities. She was with me that day, and we were both witnesses to this event that day, but nobody knew. I hadn't told anybody about that was the exact same spot where I told this case had happened. And I'm just thinking, boy, this is going to be something if 60 of us drop here on the beach,
Nobody
yeah.
can move. Oh, yeah, that would be amazing.
Yeah, and that did not happen, but yeah, that was quite the day, I'll tell you. It was interesting. It was the greatest chance I ever had to watch multiple witnesses and the variety of reaction. Oh my God, that was every bit as interesting. It was.
I can imagine. Wow.
It went from one extreme to the other and everything in between. Everything from apathy to literally people pulling their hair out to fear, dropping everything and running. Just the full range, right? And some people, were not fine for several days.
Mhm.
Incredible.
It's hard to
stuff.
process, I think, for some people when you've never been exposed to this. I mean, it's definitely a world changer for anybody, really.
Well, something, again, and I thank you now, Preston, for bringing it up because you remind me something that I think is the takeaway on another case. When I spoke about the Smith brothers, who, the bounty covered up in the car, and that Lawrence Smith, that one of the pair of brothers, what he often said to me when he first told his story, very reluctantly, the first time I went to his home, he had a second wife and he put her out of the house. He wouldn't talk with anyone else there. And I had a very, very difficult time getting this man to open up, but eventually he did. And one of the things that I've always talked about is like, well, so the first thing he asked me when he first started to speak is, do you know what happened to me? And I said, no, not really. And he's like, did it happen to you? I said, I don't believe so. And then he says, the best way I can describe it is there was my life before that day, and there's been my life since.
Yeah.
And they couldn't be any more different. And I said, what was it like after it? He says, I know that everything I'd ever been taught and everybody I'd ever trusted was lying to me.
Yeah. It's a collapse of your entire
To
belief
collapse
system.
the entire belief system. You could trust no one. It was, I could not trust what my mom and dad had told me, what the priest told me, my teachers, anybody. My wife, he said it was just gone. People would tell me, no, I wouldn't worry about that or that can't be. But, you've been there, you've crossed that clinical threshold, haven't you? It's in your face. There's no denying it, right? It reminds me the impact, the way I put it, it's almost like that, before they watered down the concept in the Star Trek series, The Next Generation, that cliffhanger end, where Picard's captured by the Borg, right? And he
Yeah.
says, well, we're a free, determinate species, and we'll, we'll choose death, right? And as the Borg replies, death is
You will
irrelevant.
be
You
assimilated.
will be assimilated. Death is irrelevant.
Yep.
I mean, how small are you then? How insignificant? How without purpose, right? And it made me think of that scene, when he told me that, because he said it, you could hear the emotional tone, right? Like everybody lies here. There's no truth. Nobody knows, And I think one of the reasons he opened up to me was I said, I don't know what happened to you. I don't know if I'll be able to explain it, but I'm here to listen, without judgment, right?
Well, I'd like to pop up a few questions because we're down to our last 10 minutes or so.
Yeah.
And we always like to answer questions. And this is the first one that actually came in 5 minutes in. This is from Kenny McLeod. And it says, my question is, why do dogs almost uniformly react viciously to the alien presence even when they can't see them? They can definitely, I know many cases where they sense them.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know why it's vicious. Like Preston just said, it's obvious. I think they can sense it. And I have often told people like that do investigations with paranormal groups and other groups that are big on using the techie equipment and saying they're not covered up. But I said, bring a well-controlled dog, from a trusted member, because they are so sensitive. I don't know, the viciousness could just be the fact that they're trying to protect the master or protector, or it's just the unusualness of it.
Those are also the most, how do I put this? Those are the stories you hear because those are the stories the media wants you to hear. Most animals don't react that way at all. Not at all.
Yeah. I in my thing, I've seen them bark and respond. Some of them, I've seen fearful reactions in dogs when something's been nearby.
Just depends.
Well, all animals really.
Yeah. But I think the key takeaway is that sensitivity and the reliability. I think it's an assertion that yes, there is something there.
Yeah. Well, they have incredible hearing that we don't have. They have incredible smell that we don't have. And craft are not deadly silent. They can be heard on a frequency that we don't receive. And dogs especially can pick up on it and hear it. Some dogs will even howl at it like they're hearing sirens. They'll go, ooh.
Yeah. There's a million cases of that.
Yeah. Their sensorium is so much more finely attuned than ours that way. I mean, we have a very narrow spectrum, audio-wise, visual, etc. Yeah.
Yes. And a dog will protect its family. You're exactly right. We had German Shepherds and St. Bernards, and every last one of them knew when somebody was coming. Everyone. And the only dog that didn't try to outright protect me, knew I was safe, was my Heidi. She was mine, and she'd go with me. So, everybody else was going like, why are you here? But yeah.
All right, I'm going to pop up a few more questions. This is from Leah. It's an unusual question, but all questions are fair game. I have heard a lot about the inner Earth beings. What do you think? Anyone have contact? Reptilians, I think, may come from inner Earth, but I don't know. I don't know much about
I have not actually. I mean, I've heard of them. I've only ever had one other person ask me that actually, and
I want people to describe what they mean by inner Earth because I don't think everybody's on the same page. Because
I actually have to say, I have to say I don't know. I don't know of anyone that's claimed actual contact. I've heard people say that there are inner Earth beings, and beyond that, I've had little detail when I've heard a report of them from somebody, So yeah, you kind of got me on that one. You're going to have to find someone that's had the experience or researched that, and in all the things I've done, it hasn't taken me to that yet. So.
All right, well, here's a great question from Bob Thorson. Chris, after all your years in the field, has your personal belief system evolved. Are you more certain or more uncertain about what's going on?
Well, I'm more certain for a couple reasons, but it has changed. In some ways, it's diminished too. Let me explain. I I'm certain that there is a phenomena that we don't understand that's powerful, pervasive. Um, it's been here a long time. What I spend less time now thinking about the big questions. In the beginning, I was the guy who wanted to find and dig up the door off one of these things and drop it on the stage with a clang. And, that was my goal. That's long gone. Right. I now feel that I've learned to live with the uncertainty, but at the same time, I'm more certain that we are not alone. I've been up against it, I've been there. And in a way, that's kind of satisfying. I'm less concerned with point of origin and mission and these kind of things. And I'm more interested in the comprehension as to the range and why this is so hard. Like, one of the things I think is that it's been a mistake through the history of this field to try to identify what's going on by the appearance of things. And just as much as it was a mistake in biology to try to connect animals, like most people would not consider that one of the closest relatives of a panda bear is a raccoon. But when you see the ring-tailed panda in between, it sort of makes sense. But, to just judge things on appearances, and this is why when I was in high school, there were considered to be 5 domains of life, and now there's only 3 because they're not looking at the appearance of life and the appearance of the different categories, but how it actually functions. And of course, a lot of that has been learned from DNA too. So I'm more certain than ever, and I'm at peace that there is something, and I'm not going to have all the answers. But I've drugged this thing, I think, into the life a day, and I've shown how things can. I don't think anybody has the really big answers as an individual. I think that yes, government knows more than it says. I don't know how deep it goes. And the thing is, what is government? Is it the elected officials or is it rogue elements in the intelligence community? And I've been lucky enough to sit down face to face. I had my government arrange for me to interact with the KGB before it fell to the SRB and that. And I love showing those letters of how the government set it up. And it was, a sensitive thing. But, in the end, I think it's rugged individuals that hold this close to their case. I think it's interesting when I hear the disclosure movement now and people say, well, look at this and it's never been this open. But I remember when Roscoe Hillencoter, one of the purported members of MJ12, sick and dying of cancer, talked to the New York Times, and it was on the front page. And we're still waiting for disclosure. So I'm not that patient, right? So I keep looking and find. But I've seen enough in my life that I know there's something, and I know we won't know everything. But then again, in my lifetime, I've seen Nobel Prizes given for something as simple as how primary colors worked, and then they were later proven by the man who developed the land Polaroid camera to be wrong. That's the unsatisfying about science, and I think ufology is the truth. It can change all the time, with greater understanding. But once you learn to accept that, life becomes a little bit easier. But still, you have the urge to get closer to learn more, right? But every time you learn more, you'll learn how much more you don't know, too.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Dolly, Namaste is requesting, can you read Talata's words on the importance of love?
Sure.
And while you're looking for that, I'm just going to pop up this next question from Andrew Rollins. Does a saucer top spin in one direction and the bottom half spin in the opposite? I do know of cases like that. I don't think that that's a hard and fast rule, though. I just looked into a case like that, actually.
Yeah. Oh, really? Well, yeah, you're getting more of them. That's yeah, I've heard of that, but not in any case that I've investigated. I've certainly seen it in reports of others, usually from back in that more classic period. You know what I mean? But lots of spinning cases. I've seen one in the high Arctic that's unknown where something went down and landed in a bunch of in the summer when everything was thawed in, a bunch of bulrushes and that. And people ducked and ran, thought they were going to be hit by flying debris, and that again, people went in and investigated, but no trace could ever be found. But you could see the physical damage that something had gone in that was spinning rapidly, and some people said the top spun in the opposite direction there. But not a case that I've personally investigated. But
no, me either. But I've certainly heard of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're getting low on time, so
yeah.
Right, I found it. Chris, Talata is my contact. He's an entity that I fly with on board craft. He is the craft. He indwells it. He's a fifth dimensional being, and he comes through into the third dimension with that craft. His name, I call him Talata because there's no way for me to pronounce his real name. No, I'm not even trying. Okay. And he made me he dictated this to me word for word to go into the book Symmetry.
Yeah, this is about 1 minute long, so
this is E.T.'s Hope for Humanity. Okay. And he titled it Be Strong in Love. And it says, love is what carries through. Love is what heals. Love is the strength of life. Love has no limit. Therefore, let love become who you are. Let love evolve to its fruition. Let the light that is love burn bright. Let its wisdom guide you to higher understanding, and let its power move you to teach its power to others. Love, be strong in love. That is their number one request of humanity, period. And Namaste knows as well, and she's heard me speak up in Virginia, and that's why she's asking for it tonight. So
okay, yeah,
it's a good way to close the show. Do you have any last things you want to mention? Of course,
all I want to say is it's been a pleasure to be here again. Love to do it someday if I get something more to offer. And I can't wait to meet you two in person down there in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, which is somewhere Betty Hill used to love to travel to all the time with Barney, and even after his passing, right? But there's so much I hope to go through with you there, and maybe some of your audience there might want to find their way to something different there.
Absolutely, you can
it's
look
a unique conference, because like I say, the next day we go to the actual sites where all this stuff happened,
which we are going to go on. We're going to
you're going to go down to the Shelburne base. We're going to go right to the gates. I talk right there to close this thing. We're going to go where the UFO crashed in Shag Harbor, or the near the shoreline will. It's only 300 yards offshore. You're going to see it all. Yeah, because this conference, you can meet the experts. The actual witnesses are still alive and go there, many of them. And
cool.
Yeah, it's a slice of life, right? And American money goes a long way. We got a great deal in the hotel there. So people that don't even want to fly or drive, if you're in New England, you can drive to Bar Harbor and get on the ferry. And when you get off on the Yarmouth side, you can walk to the venue. It's that close.
That's fantastic.
It'd be just like, you can do it as an overnight day trip kind of thing, So
right.
That's an oxymoron, but anyway.
Do you want to pop up the book and Sweep Clear 5?
Yeah.
Yeah, NATO's UFO encounter. Check it out, you guys. One of the most important incidents, I think, that everyone deserves to know about. And of course, Impact to Contact, the Shag Harbor incident.
Yeah.
Check it out. It's the world's only officially documented UFO crash. Amazing. So thanks very much, Chris.
Well,
it's been a wonderful show.
Thank you both for so much having back. It's been a pleasure. It's interesting. I love your format. I love your show.
We'd love for you to come back again before we go to Shag Harbor, probably in September if you're free. Would you like to come on again?
Yeah. We'll make time. Yeah. Mondays work so good because I got a lot of weekends booked up then. I'm doing a maritime tour, but that's going to be perfect. Yeah. And we'll find something we haven't talked about yet, and we'll touch on a little bit of everything. It's a pleasure. Sure. God bless you. Looking forward to meeting you.
We're out of time, so thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Janie Mashburn, namaste. We really appreciate you guys. Bob Thorson, OGG, UKGB. Thank you guys so much. Larry Hank, you guys are amazing. Yep. We are truly thankful. Kenny and Sonny Burnett, you guys are just so wonderful and generous. We love all of you. So thank you all.
Yeah. All right, the Light Gate has been coming to you live from the beautiful city of New Orleans in Louisiana at the United Public Radio Network at 107.7 FM and the UFO Paranormal Radio Network at 105.3 FM. We are on Facebook, we're on Roku, we're on Rumble, and we are on YouTube. Everybody, please have a wonderful week. I want to shout out to one person who is not with us tonight. Her name is Polly Rodman, and she is in harm's way tonight in Israel. She's in Tel Aviv, and I want everybody to keep her in your thoughts and prayers to keep her safe and her son safe. And then after that, namaste, everybody. We love you very much. Night, night.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.